G'day, legends. I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and I'm having a brilliant day because I'm here with someone who has written some absolutely fantastic books and has put so much of what we talk about into a far more academic and understandable way. Now, off camera, we had to talk about how to pronounce Mr. Jacques Baud's name, because me reading it as an Australian, like most of our English, we butcher the King's language. And one of the guys behind the scenes who works for me, he's French. And every couple of days, I get hit up with, oh my God, I can't believe how you pronounce this. But Mr. Jacques Baud, the author of The Russian Art of War and more recently, The Covert Wars in Ukraine, thank you for coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. That is a pleasure and very honor to me to be with you. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. And for those of you who are unaware, I've just got some notes here. But Jacques Baud, he's a retired Swiss Army colonel of the General Staff, and he served at the highest levels in the Swiss strategic intelligence. And he's monitored everything from Warsaw Pact military forces through the Cold War, working in with NATO, the UN, including in areas of arms control, counterterrorism, post-conflict stabilisation. And a lot of what we are going to speak about in The Russian Art of War is the holistic misunderstanding of war that a lot of Western analysts and even commanders have, and how Russia conduct its military operations, and our inability or our misunderstanding of how that is taken, and how we may see it in a light and have the wrong idea of how that then comes to fruition actually on the battlefield, as not just isolated events, but as more, I think you put it in the book, as they see it more of a film than a photograph. And that is, you know, a real bit of a mind twist to get around. But is there anything of who you are that I haven't gone over there, or who you'd like to explain who you are now?
Well, I think you said everything. I had although I'm from the Swiss Army, and obviously Switzerland is not involved in many wars, or in any, in fact, but I had the opportunity through the United Nations, and also in NATO, because I was the only Swiss person working in NATO, Switzerland not being member of NATO, but I had a special mandate in NATO, and so I had the opportunity to be close to the battlefield in the capacity of peacekeeping operation. I think I've been twice in Afghanistan. I've been in other places, in Darfur, in Eastern Congo, in Somalia, in Chad. So I had quite an extensive understanding of war, first of all. And I had, because I could combine this with my previous life in the strategic intelligence. I used to be trained in the US intelligence and British intelligence, by the way, where I had an excellent Australian instructor, by the way. So that gives me some, let's say, that helps me, I better say, that helps me to have the big picture as it comes to conflict and all that. And I always refuse to belong to any political party, Switzerland and others. I don't, I think that for an intelligence officer, we need to have a candid approach to think. And this candid approach cannot be tainted by politics. And therefore, I always tried to assess the conflict based on facts, not on my own prejudice or preconceived ideas or whatever. And that helps to have the real, as far as we can, the real picture of what's going on. And that's extremely helpful, because in the many books I have written in the last, let's say, 10 years or even more, I noticed that everything I said proved to be right. And still today, the assessment I made 10 years ago or even more are still valid again. So and that's probably a good start for discussion, because when we try to assess war, we should forget about who is the bad guy and who is the good guy. We need to understand how both parties think. And there is not a good or bad way of thinking. There are just ways of thinking. You know, there's not a bad Russian way, a bad Chinese way, and a good American, a good Western way. This doesn't exist. There are just simply different ways of understanding war. And that, I think, should be the approach, especially today, because we are approaching this meeting between Trump and Putin, and we see in that context that the perception of war, the perception of what's going on on the battlefield in Ukraine, affects the way we want to approach peace. And that's also, I think, a fundamental aspect of geopolitical and geostrategic analysis. The way you understand the crisis affects the way you will solve it. If you don't understand it properly, you will not solve it properly. And that's exactly what we see today when we compare the Western approach to the Ukraine war and the Russian approach. And if I look at the operations on the ground, and I look at them not from a partisan point of view, but from a strategic analyst's point of view, I can see that the Russians understand the Ukrainians and the Westerners much better than the Westerners understand Russia. And that's exactly explained to a very large extent the reason why the Russians are winning on the ground. Because if you don't understand your enemy, there's absolutely no way you can win. And that's not my invention. Sun Tzu, more than 2,500 years ago, said exactly the same thing. Understand your enemy. And by the way, and again, that's also a start of our discussion. We have to remember that the word intelligence comes from the Latin word intellegere, used by the Romans. Intellegere means to understand. It doesn't mean to spy, to look, to that. It means to understand. And that's the fundamental issue in intelligence, to understand. And that's I think, something that we need to keep in mind. And in the West, in the last 30 years or so, since we focused on issues that require an extreme granularity of information, and namely terrorism, because it's very hard to assess terrorism from far away. You need, to a certain point, you need to have an access to any information, and information, you have to be very close to the terrorists themselves. Therefore, the nature of information that is required to understand terrorism are both strategic and very, very, very tactical. As a result, we tended in the West to ignore the, let's say, the real understanding of things. We focus on the more information. We want to know when, where and when the next bombing will take place. That's what we are trying to do. And therefore, we need a lot of information. And therefore, for us, intelligence has not been focused on to understanding, but on knowing. The problem is that when we address conflicts such as, conventional conflicts, such as in Ukraine, we need definitely to understand. Of course, we need to know exactly where the artillery pieces are, where the units are deployed, and things like this in order to strike them. That's definitely true. But at the end of the day, what we need to understand is why are those units deployed there? What is the intent of the enemy? And therefore, we have to understand the system, the mechanic of the whole thing. And the Russians are much better to do that because, as Vladimir Putin said, and I think it's very true, he said, we are better than the Westerners because we have smaller intelligence structures. Because the more you have, the more you tend to gather information, and the more this information tends to be in clusters and stuck into clusters. When you have a small organization, it's easier to share that information. As you rightly said in introduction, I was in the Swiss Strategic Intelligence, which at that time during the Cold War, it was an extremely tiny organization. But the privilege of that is that as I was responsible for all Warsaw Pact forces, I was able to integrate all the information I had and to have definitely a big picture and to understand what they were doing and all that. And that's, the same job as mine was done in the CIA, as an example, by the director of intelligence with hundreds of people. The problem is that it was easier for me to have this overall picture of the integration of forces, integration of doctrine, integration of all that into one big picture than for the director of intelligence in the CIA, because all the information and the knowledge was scattered among thousands of CIA analysts and employees. And no question, they were excellent. But it's the bigger the organization, the more difficult it is to integrate the all information into one big picture. So I just wanted to say that as at the beginning, because I think it's very important to understand, because most of our intelligence organization today tends to ask for more people and more assets and more sensors and all that, which might be fine in certain circumstances. But I would say that in the last 30 years, what I've noticed is a worsening of the analytical capabilities. We have better collection capabilities and capacities, but this was at the price of degrading the analytical ability of even in the forces, because we tend to rely on what we sense, on what we know, instead of relying on trying to understand what's happening in front of us. And I think it's important to say that at this stage, because it affects definitely our understanding of the conflict in Ukraine, but it should also affect our way of understanding the conflict in Palestine, for instance, or the conflict with Iran, or other type of conflict, including counterterrorism. I've written quite extensively on how to fight jihadist and jihadi terrorism. And in fact, definitely we are talking about a totally different operational and strategic situation, and different structure of units, and different structure of the battlefield as well. But at the same, from an intelligence point of view, you have exactly the same problem. You have information coming out of the battlefield, and you have to make sense of that and try to understand, what does the enemy want? If it's a Russian, he has tanks, aircraft, helicopter, you name it, all that. If it's a ISIS guy, he will have just a couple of drones and and pickup trucks and things like this. But the essence of the intelligence remains the same: to understand what does this guy want and what is the role of this tactical event in the bigger picture. I think that's sorry. I just wanted to put that as a starter, and maybe we can elaborate on that later.
No, it's a fantastic place to begin, and it's something that I speak about a lot, of this misunderstanding of the very fundamentals of war and why war is fought. And I personally don't look any further than, of course, Karl von Clausewitz with On War, that war is politics by other means, and this is why war is fought, to achieve political objectives. And you break it down really well in The Russian Art of War, that there is this misunderstanding of what is tactics, what is operational, what is strategy, and what is politics. And then to go back to Clausewitzian ideas of that there are no single events, it is to build on each other. And I often, in my videos, talking to my audience, I describe war like an organism, that although it's happening over here, it affects the entire piece.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there is this complete disconnect that I'm seeing at the moment between the battlefield and then diplomatic realities, and that war is just a tool of politics. It's a blunt force. It's a blunt tool. It's a blunt force tool, but it is a tool of politics when all else has failed. That's what you then resort back to. But the inability to, because even down to this idea that Zelensky, if he goes to Alaska in a couple of days from now, I'm not sure if this will be out before then or now, but that the battlefield will have no effect on the position of which Zelensky and Putin is coming to this. And my pushback is, well, then you don't understand the very fundamentals of war. That at the end of the day, the diplomat is a servant to the warrior. But to extend on something you said in your opening piece, you say in the very beginning on The Russian Art of War that the adversary is so stupidly demonized that we fail to understand his way of thinking. As a result, we are unable to develop strategies, articulate our forces, or even equip them for the reality of the war. And I think that is such a fantastic opening to this whole idea of whether you are on the pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian side. If you step into this with these are no more than orc forces doing this or whatever you'd like the other way, that by completely disregarding the ability to evolve or work or to achieve tactical, operational, and strategic political objectives, you will not be able to actually then assess this. And you then go further on this a little bit later on in page 42, going tactical objectives must promote the achievement of an operational objectives, which in turn must promote the achievement of strategic objectives of a political or military nature. And this is that's Clausewitzian, I believe, sort of 101 about it's used as a tool of diplomacy. It's blunt force, it's savage, it's cruel. And the type of war, whether attritional or maneuver or counter-terror, is the way in which you conduct that politics. But at the end of the day, if you just, as you say, stupidly demonize the other side, even if you emotionally have that impact, you will have an incorrect outcome, letting that saturate your viewpoint from there. What is it, do you think, that is our main Western misunderstanding about how Russia, as you put in the book, more holistically see the art of war achieving those political outcomes?
Well, first of all, there are different facets or different views or different ways to answer that question, because obviously the most obvious one is that we in fact refuse to understand the Russians. We don't want to see what they are, what their aims are, and things like this. We have defined Russia as an enemy, and that's it. I mean, if you look at the facts since 2014, almost everything we have said on Russia was wrong, including what we have told about the interference into election and all that. We see that all that has been blown up since then, because that was just lies. The problem is that we continue to see the Russian through these lies. And this has an effect on the way we want to address the problem and we want to solve the problem. We have mentioned a couple of ways. The next meeting with Vladimir Putin and Trump in Alaska on the 15th of June of August. But you know, the interesting aspect here, just this meeting, in fact, could exemplify everything we have discussed on the art of war, because the Europeans continue to make a distinction between ceasefire, or let's say the Europeans and the West at large tend to confuse, better said, ceasefire and peace, while the Russians make a clear distinction between the two. Ceasefire is just a mean to achieve peace. It's a tool. It's a part of but it's not the equivalent. And when we say, for instance, that Vladimir Putin refused a ceasefire because he refused peace, it's a deliberate misunderstanding of the situation. The Russians, as you rightly remind us, see war and peace, by the way, because it's in essence the same, let's say, process. They see it as a film, as a movie, not as a picture. As a result, if you read the memorandum that was distributed by the Russians on the 2nd of June this year to the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul, you will see that they see the ceasefire as part of a process that should lead to peace. And the whole thing is a process. If you read the memorandum, you will see it's almost described as the scenario of a movie. All the steps are clearly defined. You see exactly what steps leads to which step. It's described exactly like you would see the script of a movie. While on the Western side, they just ask for a ceasefire without knowing exactly where it leads to. In fact, they never defined where they want to go. And hence, you can explain, in fact, what we see is that they don't want to stop the war, but they just want to have a pause in the war in order to so this different approach is even seen in the whole process of making peace. Now, the Russians see, and if you remember, on the 24th of February 2022, at the beginning of the special military operation, Vladimir Putin defined two objectives: demilitarization, denazification. And of course, in the West, we tried to interpret those objectives and try to define them or to describe them, but we never really tried even to understand what Vladimir Putin meant. The rationale to intervene in Ukraine, the primary rationale, I mean, the physical primary, I would say, is the threat on the population of the Donbass. The physical threat, because Ukraine was preparing and starting an offensive against the Donbass. And that's what prompted the Russian intervention. And we have seen, by the way, that they were not exactly ready for that because they were prompted to intervene. It was not their date of choice, if you want. They were forced into the intervention. And for that reason, we could see that they were not completely prepared and they had to find a solution to not integrate, but coordinate with in fact, you had three armies starting on the 24th February. You had the Russian army in Crimea and in the northern part of the Donbass. And in the center part of the Donbass, you had two other armies, the Army of the Republic of Donetsk and the Army of the Republic of Lugansk, popular armies. I mean, that the popular the Lugansk Popular Army and the Donetsk Popular Army. We were militia army, not professional. And that's why those armies were poorly equipped and poorly trained and all that. And that explains why you had some hiccups, especially in the Donbass area. Whereas on the other places where the Russian army was in charge, in control, you had those huge offensive all through the border to Kiev and in the north, and in the south you had this operation up to Kherson. Now, the interesting thing here is that the objective of demilitarization was initially designed to address the military threat on the Donbass. Denazification addressed the fight against those militia, paramilitary militias that still exist, by the way, in Ukraine. But now we see that those two objectives are still valid, but they have changed in substance, because from a tactical, operational point of view, we have moved towards a situation which is more strategic in nature, if you want, especially when we talk to the discussion in Alaska. Therefore, the initial idea of demilitarization was to destroy or neutralize, at the beginning, neutralize the Ukrainian army. As the first attempt to have a negotiation failed due to Europe, and I remind you that there were 3 attempts to have a negotiation on the 25th of February 2022, just one day after the start of the military operation, Zelensky called the Swiss Minister of Foreign Affairs and asked to organize a peace conference. That led to the Gomel negotiation at the Belarus border, and that failed due to European Union. Then Zelensky made a second try and asked the Russians to have the negotiation. And that led to the Istanbul negotiation in March, end of March, early April 2022. And that was also short-circuited by Boris Johnson, but not only. In fact, the Germans and the French were also here to sabotage the whole thing. And then there were a third attempt under the auspices of Turkey, late August or mid-August, I would say, 2022. And all that failed due to the Europeans, because Boris Johnson in August also intervened and said, stop that. And so from that point, the Russians changed the tactical or operational concept. Instead of trying to put pressure on Kiev through large operation all over the territory of Ukraine, they decided to grind down the Ukrainian army. Instead of neutralize the Ukrainian army, they decided to destroy the Ukrainian army. And that's where they started this kind of attrition war. And that started in October 2022.
And are you surprised it's taken this long for the Russians to really achieve? Only today we have seen some of the byproducts you get of attrition of these, then the byproduct of large amount of ground, but today, up to 19 kilometers being made. But have you been surprised following these initial failures that we had seen as well take place? Are you surprised that it has taken this long to start seeing, and this costly to the Russian forces before they've achieved the results and still a ways off to achieving the desired effect?
Well, yes and no, because in fact, if you think, you go into the details, you will see that in fact the Russian army has defeated the Ukrainian army 3 times. and probably more. I mean, remember that the reason why Zelensky asked for a negotiated solution is because he was losing. And in May, June 2022, Zelensky himself said that from now on, we rely on our Western allies to continue the war because all the equipment had been destroyed by the Russians. And that's May, June 2022 is, in fact, the date, or yes, the period where the first Ukrainian army had been destroyed in material terms, not personal terms, material terms. And from that point on, you had equipment pouring in Ukraine from from Europe, especially those former communist countries who had some old T-60s to 72 and so on, even refurbished or even modernized T-72 and so on and so forth. And you had all these old artillery pieces, tank armor and all that from the former Warsaw Pact pouring in Ukraine. And that was the second half of 2022. And that's where at that time you had no real need for instance, 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, because the artillery was still relying on old Soviet 152 millimeter. And you had this up to the end of 22. Now, in end of 2022, and remember that in summer 2022, Zelensky promised to have this big counteroffensive, but he never managed to do it because his equipment was destroyed as it arrived on the battlefield. It was destroyed, and all the equipment of the first Ukrainian army, and then all this old European equipment coming in the second part of 2022 was destroyed. And at the end of 2022, December 2022, as the Ukrainians had still in mind to make this big counteroffensive, they realized that they had no equipment to do that. And that's where they asked the US for having M1 Abrams and the Germans to have those Leopard 2 tanks and things like that. And that started to come, and beginning of 2023. And that was in fact, the third Ukraine army, if you want, because they still had personnel, but the equipment had been destroyed. And they started the counteroffensive in June 2023 without having the whole equipment they needed to do that. And especially what they missed at this point was not simply the equipment, but was in fact the ability to integrate this equipment into an operational and doctrinal consistency. That was the big failure they had. They had a few Abrams there, a few Challenger there, a few Leopard 2 here and there, and they started to use that. But if you notice, and that was also noticed at that point, that armor or tanks were not used as tanks. It was used as mobile artillery pieces and infantry support rather than for real armored defensives, because there was no integration, and because they had no time to do that. And the integration of such complex systems requires also a complex integration in terms of logistics and also doctrinal, because you can probably compare the performance or the abilities of M1 Abrams and Leopard 2 Probably they are very similar. But as soon as you have Leopard 1, for instance, then the whole thing changes, because they have definitely not the same capacity, or the AMX 10RC provided by the French. They had totally different operational capabilities. Therefore, it was very difficult to integrate those different equipment into a single, even tactical concept, in fact.
Unbelievable. And unbelievably difficult too for the doctrine of which that we had developed that was then became irrelevant on a battlefield like this. That looking back, I was reading an academic study on this just yesterday, is that we created a Ukrainian army in our reflection instead of reflecting their learnt doctrine back upon themselves. And we know this through, I think it was maybe the New York Times speaking to the Ukrainians who were trained on some of the Leopard tanks from the German tankers, and asking about what do we do when we make it to the Surovikin line and there's a kilometre of minefield. What do we do? Go around it if you can. And for anyone who understands how that line looked, that's a ridiculous answer. But we didn't have the operational doctrine to be able to actually advise on this. And we had this idea of this NATO superiority in doctrine complex when it comes to attritional war. I am a believer in that doctrine, in the high-end maneuver, decisive battle, very quick win in some areas, but not in a long dug-in war like this, where the importance is to be able to absorb losses, redeploy forces, and inflate your forces very quickly with the simplicity of equipment, training, and doctrine, which we did see the Soviets. That is part of their art, of even down to the lack of NCO corps with the initial failures of the Russians. But you develop a pseudo NCO corps through years of fighting, and therefore the ability to absorb much more loss. But that reflection of the operational capability and doctrine, and the ability to be incredibly flexible. And I know that Dr. Skandaraman, he says this about no matter what tactic we start a war with, it will be wrong. We just need the flexibility to correct it very quickly. And I think that's one thing we saw the Russians with their initial military failures, their massive underestimation of, I believe, the cost of the war too. But over these time has been able to adjust somewhat. Do you disagree with that?
Well, I have a more nuanced approach to that, because, as I said, the Russians were able, as I said, to destroy the Ukrainian army from a material point of view. But now, if you address the difficulties of the Russians at the very beginning of the special military operation, again, you have to understand this, what I reminded before, that you had, in fact, 3 armies starting this intervention. And the Russians were definitely the best trained, the best equipped, and they had the doctrinal integration of everything. So, I mean, everything was doctrinally consistent. Whereas in the Donbass armies, you had not exactly the same. I mean, they were not designed for a big counteroffensive or deep operations and things like this. You know, it was essentially, there were militia armies designed for defense, with rather simply, they were all militias. That means all the soldiers were in fact also citizens. That means they had not an extensive training. You could see also the, because at this stage you had a lot of mockeries about the communication system you had, but these two Lugansk and Donetsk popular armies relied very much on commercial Motorola communication devices, you know, talkie-walkies, basically, that are very easily to jam, very easily to listen, or to intercept, and all that. And meaning that, and from a command point of view, and so very important to understand that when the special military operation started, you had not an integrated command from a Russian point of view. You had a coordinated command, meaning that you had a command for the Donetsk army, the Lugansk army, and the Russian army. And all that was coordinated. It was not under a single command. It was just a coordination, meaning that the line of command is not as straightforward as you may know in your own army when you have, I mean, you have your command structure, your command and control structure, and this is extremely as streamlined as possible in order to facilitate the orders and the execution of orders and all that. Now, when you have a coordination, that means you may lose some information on the line somehow, if I can put the thing a little bit simply. It's more difficult to coordinate. The equipment was not the same. A lot of equipment of those Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk was the equipment provided by those defectors from the Ukrainian army in between 2014 and 2022. Meaning that you had old equipment, basically old T-62s or T-64 that were not up to, I mean, not even modernized and all that. So they were not prepared for war. And that's the reason why we have the feeling that the Russians had a difficult, I mean, the Russian camp, if I can put it, not the Russian party had a problem, but not the Russian army. It was because you had those two, let's say, more cheaper armies, if you want. They were brave soldiers, by the way. They fought extremely bravely, but they were ill-equipped and ill-trained for that. After the September 2022, after the referendum that integrated these the republics into the Russian Federation, then started the process of integrating those forces into the Russian army. And then you started to have an integrated command under General Surovikin, by the way. And that means you had one commander for the whole Russian party, if you want. And then you started also to harmonize processes, procedures, equipment, and then those armies or former armies of Lugansk and Donetsk received more modern equipment. They were trained. You had, in fact, Russian soldiers replaced Lugansk and Donetsk soldiers on the front line in order to allow the training for those soldiers of the former armies. So you had kind of a rotation of forces. And now, as of today, you have a very homogeneous army. It's one army. But it's very important to remember that during the first year, in essence, of this intervention, you had three armies on the Russian side, three distinct armies with distinct command and distinct weapons and all that. So that therefore, what you say is right if we look from far away. But if we zoom in a little bit onto the operational battlefield, then we see there are some explanation for that. And if we look at the Russian forces, I mean the pure Russian forces at the very beginning, we don't see all the failures you had in the Donbass. You had a very a different command. The quality of the commanders was slightly different because they were trained for these kind of offensive defensive operations. You see, the whole doctrine since World War II, in fact, the Russian doctrine was, and there were a lot of discussions already at the end of the Soviet Union, in fact, on how you should define the way the Russians should fight. Is it offensive defense or defensive offense? See, you had all these question of terminology. It was discussed, and you still find the discussion, by the way, in the military Russian military literature today. So the idea is that when you defend yourself, you have phases, or even it's preferable to take the offensive, but the strategic posture is defensive, and the operational posture is offensive. To simplify a little bit, you see, you offense to defend yourself. So, like you could say, preemptive strikes or things like this. This is very much in this kind of idea. And therefore, the Russian doctrine is, even if it's defensive in essence, it doesn't preclude the use of offensive operation and offensive operations in the depth of the enemy. And that's a concept that you had, and you still have, in the Russian army, but you didn't have in the Donbas Republic armies, because they had not the capacity of having of conducting operations in the depth of the enemy. Therefore, it was more purely defensive, if you want. So these differences today have been harmonized, and now you barely can make any difference between Donbas units and Russian pure Russian unit, if you want, you can put it that way. But what is interesting here, and I come back to what I said in terms of the evolution of the objectives and the adaptation of the objectives. So the very start of the concept of demilitarization was definitely tactical, operational. But today, we see, when we talk about the next negotiation in Alaska, the concept of demilitarization is still there, but it has lost a lot of significance in military terms. It has gained more significance in the political or geostrategic sense, in the sense that one aspect of the demilitarization today, which has always been present, by the way, but now it gained more importance, is the fact that Ukraine should not belong to NATO, and not even to EU, because EU is becoming militarized and has, as Sergei Lavrov said, EU has become like a small NATO. And therefore, now the Russians, in the concept of demilitarization, they have evolved from a tactical operational concept into something which is more geostrategic in essence. And again, I don't know what Putin and Trump will talk together, but my feeling is that this aspect, besides the territorial aspect, which is also, by the way, an evolution of the initial objectives, I come back on this later, but they will discuss not just the neutralization of the Ukrainian armed forces, but they will also discuss the inability of Ukraine to have NATO membership, and even probably EU membership. And you see the same evolution for the denazification, because at the very beginning, the idea of denazification, and the two terms, in fact, were taken, you know that Putin loves history, and he took those two words from the Potsdam Declaration of 1945. In 1945, as the Allies decided, that was in January, I think, 1945, they had to decide what to do with Germany after the defeat of the Third Reich. And they decided on a policy based on the 4D, the 4Ds, better said: demilitarization, denazification, demobilization, and democratization, or decentralization, sorry, and demobilization, and democratization, sorry. So I start again: demilitarization, denazification, decentralization, and democratization. These were the 4Ds. And when Vladimir Putin started to explain his operation in Ukraine, he used the first 2Ds of the Potsdam Declaration: denazification and demobilization. Interestingly enough, the objective of denazification was seen as a tactical operational concept against those paramilitary forces and all that. And this concept, in March 2022, as the Azov brigade was encircled in Azovstal in Mariupol, the Russian military said, and that was reported by the Financial Times, by the way, said the objective of denazification has been reached. So denazification had a very much a tactical objective. And this idea, that was in March 2022, at that point, remember that there were the negotiation in Istanbul. So the Russians had achieved the two objectives they had set before. I mean, demilitarization, and that was the reason why Zelensky was asking to stop the war, because the meeting in Istanbul was at Ukrainian initiative, remind you that, and denazification has been reached through the neutralization of the Azov brigade or regiment. Nobody knows exactly what it was at that point, but anyway, in Azovstal at that in March 2022. And the 28th of March, it was said the objective of denazification has been reached. Now, things have evolved because as the Europeans, as we said before, asked Zelensky to withdraw his proposal of peace with Russia, then the whole thing resumed. And today, when we talk about the territories, the four oblasts or regions, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, that should be considered as Russian territory. Why is that so? And how the Russians justify this? Well, they justify this under the concept of denazification. And why that? Because on the 1st of July 2021, the Ukrainians adopted a law that gives the Russian citizens of Ukraine different rights as the other citizens of Ukraine. This law is the law on indigenous people, gives different rights to the Russians. And at that time, some have compared the law of this July 2021, have compared this law with the one of the Nuremberg laws of 1935 in Germany, where the Germans tried to make or to provide different rights to the Jews who were not considered as ethnic Germans and the rest of the German population. So you have a differentiated access to rights depending on your origin. Basically, your rights were based on what you are and not what you do. And that's where although the law of July 2021 is much softer than the laws of 1935 in Germany, but it's the same idea that you grant people rights based on what they are and not on what they do. And in order to keep the Russian-speaking population or the ethnic Russians living in Ukraine out of this law, which is considered as segregationist somehow, that's the rationale for the Russians to demand the full sovereignty over the four regions today. So the concept of denazification from a tactical operational point of view has evolved into something which is more geopolitical or geostrategic, if you want. And that shows that we have still the same objectives that were stated on the 24th of February 2022, but these objectives have evolved in something which is adjusted to the current situation. And that explains the way the Russians think. And you have exactly the same thing when you talk about the military or pure military objectives. As you rightly remind us before, the idea is that you use a tactical objective or a tactical success to achieve operational objective, and you use operational success to achieve strategic objectives, and you use strategic success in order to achieve political objectives. And we are exactly, and that's why the whole war needs to be understood, as you rightly said before, as a movie and not as a picture. And that explains also why the Russians do not consider that ceasefire and making war are different things. You can have simultaneously discussing peace, ceasefire, not ceasefire, sorry. Ceasefire is negotiation, sorry. Negotiation and making war are not mutually exclusive. You can still negotiate while making war, and you have, so the political aspect, again, war is the continuation of politics with other means, meaning that you achieve your success on the battlefield, and you can convert that into the negotiation on the negotiation table. So the two processes are complementary and not mutually exclusive. While on the Western side, and that's the reason why the Western powers ask to stop war in order to have a ceasefire, in order to make negotiation. Because for the West, we see ceasefire as a precondition for politics. It's not integrated. There are two, war and negotiation are two different things. You cannot make the two simultaneously. While for the Russians, it's conceptually perfectly acceptable to have the two simultaneously. And that explains why the Russians are so effective, in fact, because they see the whole picture dynamically. As we said, they see that as a movie. And very often, you see, and especially when we see those videos who are not very sharp, and so it's useful sometimes to see you see more in a movie than in a simple slide of the movie. You see, you need to see the whole picture. You see that moving, you see the dynamic aspect, and that's exactly, we can compare exactly that with the Russian understanding of war and peace, again, because war and peace are linked together, while for the Westerners, war and peace are two different things. That's that's why the Russians, in fact, are, regardless of what you think of Vladimir Putin or the Russian, the way they understand war is simply superior. It's simply superior to what we see. And the problem we have in the West, and you have been deployed in operation in Afghanistan as well, so you know that. And myself, I've seen that when I was in Afghanistan, that we tend to disconnect the tactical operation from the rest. We tend to focus on tactical success, but we don't know exactly where it leads to. And that's the weakness we have, and we have developed that because the wars we have waged in the Middle East, especially North Africa for the French, and so on, have made us focusing on the tactical success. And we don't see the relationship between the tactical success and an operational or strategic success. And in fact, we never even tried to understand the strategic thinking of the terrorists, for instance. And there is a strategic thinking. And that's I have described this in quite a detail based on what the Islamic State and others have written, because you have a lot of, and quite sharp strategists, by the way, in the Islamic State. What they write is, of course, they have their own logic, and this is their own rationale and all that. We understand that. But from a military point of view, it's far from inconsistent. In fact, it's very consistent. And understanding this consistency should help us to use the tactical action in a more effective way. But we never managed to do that. As a result, we killed a lot of people, but we never achieved strategic success.
And why is it that our senior command politicians, why is it that they can't bring that together, of this holistic view between tactics influencing operation then to strategy to politics? Why is it that these people, who are obviously very, very smart people, why is it that we haven't developed that, as you were saying, or can't translate that into battlefield victory, that we look for a decisive victory rather than to influence then outcomes of operational politics?
Well, it's not just the politicians, it's also the military. And I looked very closely, because I've made myself in Mali and Niger a couple of times. And I was quite interested in, and I know North Africa quite well, so I looked more closely at the Operation Barkhane, in the French operation in the Sahel region. And it's interesting to see that they had no real strategic objectives. And in fact, and that's something you had also at the beginning of the Vietnam War, basically, that they started, in order to illustrate or demonstrate success, they tried with the body count. And you had exactly the same thing in Afghanistan for a while, by the way, that you try to materialize success through the number of people you killed. And the military is also responsible for that, because I've looked at many military documents relating the different military operations, especially, as I said, in North Africa, in Operation Barkhane, but I never saw a real strategic objectives. I mean, strategic in the sense that how you want to defeat the enemy, how you want to defeat the threat. This has never been defined. You know, and since you don't know how you want to defeat your enemy, then the only explanation you have for fighting is just killing people. The problem is that, especially when you talk about terrorism and counterterrorism, especially the Islamist one, there are other forms of terrorism that you can probably fight that way. But when it comes to Islamic jihadi terrorists, then killing one people, and I remember a friend of mine used to be lieutenant colonel in the Barkhane operation, by the way, and spent some time there. And he told me, well, you kill one and you have 10 others that pop up, you know. So you just create new enemies by killing. Each people creates 10 others. So that means that strategically you are defeated, because at the end, it's an endless war, because you are just creating an incentive for more terrorism. So there must be other ways of addressing terrorism without creating an incentive each time you kill someone. But the military has never been able to, because at the end of the day, yes, the politicians are the ones who decide ultimately, but they need to have the advice of the militaries and from the intelligence. And I know some individuals who have been part of the military intelligence, I mean, in various countries, because I was in touch with them, and for a long time. But sometimes when people have been in the field, I mean, operational on the ground, who have been those boots on the ground, they understand sometimes the enemy much better than our generals who are in some headquarters somewhere.
Absolutely. Yes.
You see, because when you see what's going on, you are in touch with the local population, you understand how they feel and all that. And that should be, in fact, sometimes I regret that those officers who are on the ground, they should be the one who define the strategy, because sometimes they have a better understanding of the real thing. But in any case, a lot of people I have met on the ground, I noticed they understood perfectly the problem, but somehow they were unable to convey or probably they were not listened to. That's also possible. And that's very much probably, in most of cases, that's probably that you don't want to listen this captain or this major or whoever who was in the field and, is too junior, he doesn't understand things. And but the reality is that sometimes if you have a sense, and making war requires a lot of humanity. Making war requires a lot of understanding of human nature, of culture, of this whole, let's say, everything that makes the context of the war. And it's interesting because in my life, I was trained as I told you, in the US for intelligence. I met a lot of very fascinating people in the CIA or things like that. People who have been active in the CIA since the Vietnam War, and they had such a fantastic knowledge of the local cultures and the human side of the war. And sometimes you can ask yourself, why wasn't this used? Because had those people been able to explain the higher headquarters or things like that of their findings and things like this, probably the war should have been less with less casualties and probably more effective. Because at the end of the day, especially when it comes to asymmetric warfare, it's not the number of casualties that brings victory. It's sometimes the opposite, in fact. But this leads us into another discussion. I don't want to start it here. But in any case, meaning that it's not the question of being effective. It's also the question of being efficient. And here, this is a problem that the people in the headquarters, also because there are a lot of political pressure on them. That's also a reality. We have to see that being general today is a political position, in fact. And myself, I've been trained as a future general. So I made all the schools and necessary training, and as I was told by my superior, I was one of the best of my class and all that. So I could have been general, but I refused that because there is a point where your judgment, your thinking becomes affected by politics, because you are nominated or confirmed or validated by politicians. So you need to have this contact with the political life, and that's something I always refused. And that gives, on the other hand, to all these soldiers. I mean, when I say soldiers, it's a broad term that includes from colonel to the same simple trooper, but all these people who have a sense of what is war, what is really war, what they have a sense of how you wage war, and they probably know how to wage war in, I mean, I'm excluding probably some fanatics and some stupid people who are trigger happy and things like this, and these exist also. But a lot of people I've met, and most of them basically I've met at tactical level, there are people who are extremely sensible people who understand things, and these have sometimes the right feeling about wars and the way to wage war. Why the in when you are in a headquarter, then you become under political pressure. Your future is also defined by politics. Your next position is defined by politics. And it's very hard, probably at a certain level, to say, well, I don't care what my future will be. I just do what I feel the right thing to do, period. And I don't care if I get then put in some remote area or things like this. It's probably very hard to do so. But the reality is that decision making at very high level is not just based on military consideration, but also on political ones and probably ambition or self consideration and ambition, the own ambition of people. So this explains all that. But the reality is that despite all of this, if there were a consistent doctrine that would explain how to deal with or how to make war, and that would help to make decision high level, because then you could say, oh, well, it's not just my decision, it's also because our doctrine says so. So having the right doctrine for the right conflict is also important, because at the end of the day, it provides you some kind of cover to make right decision. If your doctrine is not adjusted to the conflict, then of course you're on your own when you make a decision.
Well, speaking of that doctrine, you're the subheading to your book, the one you can see above. I'm guessing it's your left shoulder, but on the right of the screen is how the West led Ukraine to defeat. Can you, I guess, explain and link that to the listeners and those who, I guess, haven't read the book?
Well, the thing is that the West, I mean, and that was even confirmed by Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, recently, when he said that the conflict in Ukraine is in fact a proxy war between Russia and the United States through Ukraine, and and this is a fact. I mean, I was working in NATO in 2000. I mean, when the whole thing started in 2014. I've been in NATO from 2012 to 2017. And I have witnessed the whole start of the thing. And it was extremely, I mean, it was obvious that from the very beginning, the whole issue of Ukraine was simply a pretext to wage war against Russia.
And why? Why? Like, not to butt in on this, but why was it that we wanted to wage war on Russia back then when things are looking better? Because this is part that a lot of people, I guess, don't understand and would push back on. Why was it? Why was there interest there?
Well, there was there's a lot. It's a convergence of different objectives. First of all, there's a sense. I mean, the well-known Wolfowitz doctrine of the U.S. that asks for this primacy of the U.S. in the world, because the U.S. has the best democracy, the best economic system, the best everything, and therefore they have to lead the world somehow. This is the idea. That's the Wolfowitz doctrine that was elaborated in the early 90s, and which is somehow still in the mind of the people. And you see that regardless whether they're Democrats or Republican, they have this idea that the US has the best system and therefore needs to lead the world. This is more or less that. And it's not necessarily to make war, but it has to lead the world, and it has to make sure that the way the US sees the world is in fact somehow followed by the others. I mean, okay. So that's the first thing. But there are other aspects, and that's why it's important sometimes to be an insider in an organization, because when I was in NATO, I was colonel, and therefore I had a lot of contact with my peers, colonels especially, I mean, from all NATO members. But what I noticed is that there were a huge discrepancy between what Donald Rumsfeld used to call the old Europe, I mean, France, Italy, Germany, UK, and the new Europe, Poland, Baltic states, the former communist state, if you want, who are member of NATO, Czech Republic, Slovak, and so on. You see a huge difference there, because those who were part of the old Europe had a more, let's say, nuanced understanding of Russia. I mean, they experienced the Cold War, and I myself, I was a Cold Warrior, and during the Cold War, I had extensive contact with Western intelligence services, and we used to fight, but we didn't fight Russians. We're fighting a system. We're fighting the communist system. We're not fighting a people. You see, that's very important to understand. We are fighting, we didn't want to be communists, in essence, that. And therefore, we had no animosity against East Germans or Poles or Russians. This was not related to the individuals or related to the peoples, so related to the political system. But today, if you look at how the Baltic states see Russia and all that, they don't see that as a political system. They see individuals. They see population. They hate the Russians. They don't hate the Russian political system. They hate the Russians. And the same with the Poles. And this is something that traces back to the Middle Ages, probably the 16th century or so. So we're talking about very old hates, in fact, that are still, and they are the interesting thing I noticed in the NATO, and which is also noticeable in the European Union, is that the influence of this new Europe over the institution is huge. It's much bigger than what we think, because these countries are the how to say that? They are 100% pro-American. That means that when you're in NATO, when you talk to different officers, and again, I'm talking to the level of colonel, so quite, let's say, higher level, if you can put it that way. Some are very critical against the United States within NATO. German officers are not always in line with the Americans, and certainly not the French, and certainly not the Italians either. They have all the criticisms. But when you talk to a Lithuanian colonel or a Polish colonel, this is no question. I mean, the US is this is the sanctity. There is no question that you would criticize the Americans, and the Americans know that, and they use those countries as a leverage in the organization, and that's very obvious in NATO. The importance, the relative importance of the new Europe towards the old Europe is tremendous.
So because this is something that many have spoken about. Sorry, just to jump in because it's relevant there. Many have said that if Trump in a couple of days signs a deal with excluding the European NATO, both the old NATO and the old Europe and the new Europe, and especially those very powerful countries, you France, Germany, and Italy, etc., that the major victory here will be that it will have maybe an existential risk to the future of NATO, because you've got the US working in line with other states who are vehemently against where that trajectory is going. And a 2019 article from Rand wrote this as a byproduct of extending Russia could be that fractures develop within these institutional structures such as NATO and the EU. Do you think that if there is a failure for the European NATO states, both old and new, in Ukraine, because they're on completely different trajectories? If you look at where Kaja Kallas compared to Merz, compared to Macron, wherever, if you see the trajectory there on what they are seeing for Ukraine versus the reality of what Trump is saying, I think Trump is more in touch with reality rather than delusion, I think, on the other side. But do you think that these fractures will develop to such an extent where the outcome could be actually a risk to the survival of that NATO institution itself?
Well, that again, it's hard to. This is certainly said as a way of make pressure over Trump. They probably try to make pressure and say, well, if you do so, that will put the integrity of the EU or the NATO in question and all that. That's certainly an argument which is probably more political than real. But there is some element of reality in that, because we see a very strong difference, especially probably not if you look at the leadership, because today Macron is a fanatical and Merz also. But if you look at the populations, they have the discrepancy between the leaders and the population is much bigger in the old Europe than in the new Europe. I mean, when the prime minister of Lithuania or Latvia or so say something, basically the whole of the population is behind him, in essence. Same probably in Poland, depending on the subject. But when you go in France, I mean, the majority of the French people don't want Ukraine to develop into kind of war. I mean, and Macron has said he was ready to send troops in Ukraine. He was even ready to share the nuclear power with other European countries. This is something the French population is totally opposed to. I mean, totally. And when you see the position of Keir Starmer, for instance, regarding Ukraine and Palestine, because that comes into the game also, you can see a huge discrepancy here between what the population feels and what the leadership feels. So the Western Europe is probably more divided internally than it is the case in the Eastern Europe. And that may affect also the relationship between the country and the institution. I mean, for instance, you have in Germany the AfD, which is the mounting political power in Germany, which is right wing, obviously. But they said that we should get out of the EU and should get out of the NATO, for instance. And you have a lot of people in France who said it was a mistake to go back in the integrated military structure of NATO. Sarkozy in 2005 resumed the integration. I mean, France has never really left NATO, but it was out of the integrated military structure of NATO. And with de Gaulle decided this in the 60s, and Sarkozy decided to rejoin the integrated military structure, and they France is full member of NATO. But a lot of people are saying we should go back to what General de Gaulle said and get out of the integrated military structure. So you have that in the Western Europe, and in Italy, a lot of friends in Italy, especially among the military, and a lot of those Italian officers are very skeptical. I mean, they have been in Afghanistan, some have been in Iraq, and they told me, I mean, they are very skeptical about the US leadership in NATO. And but that's very much Western Europe, I mean, the old Europe. In the Eastern Europe, you may have a very different view, and that may lead to something else. And you have, maybe you know, but Poland is trying to resurrect the so-called intermarium. Intermarium used to be an alliance of countries in the 17th century between Lithuania, Poland, and others. That, in fact, and the name intermarium is the fact that you link the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Intermarium means between the seas in Latin. And the one of the, let's say, priorities, I would say, of the Polish foreign policy is the revival of this intermarium, meaning an alliance, political alliance, that ultimately is to be a military alliance within NATO. And therefore, it is something, and recently, I mean, just in 2022, if I'm not wrong, or 2021, sorry, 2021, the Poland signed a treaty, a military treaty between Ukraine, Slovakia, no, wait a minute, Lithuania, and Poland. There's three countries, and already that is, in fact, the nucleus of this intermarium, because if you have this link between Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, you have already the link between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. And this was a military alliance. So we are seeing something that is evolving within NATO. A split is already somehow in the making, I would say. And probably the war in Ukraine has more or less frozen this this project to some extent, but it is there. So we might well see, as a result of the Ukrainian conflict, and as you rightly said, probably the position of the US, to a sense in the eastern part of Europe that probably we should have some independence from the rest of Europe, because the rest of Europe is probably not so keen to engage into a war against Russia. And if you take those three countries, I mean, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine, you have those countries who are in the spearhead of the fight against Russia. So we have already something like this in the making, which is very, I mean, everybody's very silent about it, but I mentioned that in one of my books, and probably the very first one of Operation Z, I think. I mentioned this and this alliance that was signed, and it was advertised by Poland. I mean, that's not something secret. That was very much publicized. The problem is that the probably for political reason in the Western media, it was not so much mentioned. But the fact of the matter is that it does exist, and there is an intent to do that. So yes, you're right. we may have, depending on how this conflict in Ukraine develops, we may have, it may lead to some kind of a further split within Europe. That's a possibility. Yes.
And what do you see as the ending to this war? Like, what will they agree to end the war as? Because we're seeing that there's this intractable gulf between where Russia and Ukraine and Europe are sitting, of Russia saying that it needs to be demilitarized. I know you say they've gone through multiple militaries, but there's still a number of hundreds of thousands of people still who are trained and equipped and fighting, and is still causing great harm to Russia advancing on the battlefield. And then we have where Russia is sitting of, we want you to be a neutral, demilitarized state, and we want to take then these territories. And that gulf is just so far apart. But what I see is, well, will Russia stop without having basically a decisive victory? But how far does it need to go to do that? What do you see as a realistic ending where the two parties are at the moment, taking into account the battlefield realities that, of course, are impacting both politics and tactics at the front line?
Well, it's a very good question. But look, in March, April 2022, I mentioned this Ukrainian initiative to have a negotiation with Russia. And they made a proposal to Russia. And in this proposal, it was already the idea of having a demilitarized Ukraine, and with security guarantees provided by 10 countries, among which Russia, by the way. And that was in the Ukrainian proposal, meaning that Ukrainians themselves have already provided a kind of solution.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that because and that was in March 2022, and since then, the Europeans have promised this this help and support for as long as it takes. And the Ukrainians, because they believe that, and because they they believe this promise, they decided to abandon the idea. They proposed themselves, meaning that, in fact, yes, we are far away. But if you look back in March, we are not so far away, because the Ukrainians themselves proposed that solution. So now, I think the Russians understand that perfectly well, and they understand that by achieving operational success on the ground, they will in fact increase the pressure, not just over Ukraine, but also over the other countries, to press Ukraine into a solution. And we may well come back to what the Ukraine proposed in 2022. That was acceptable to the Russians. The whole thing is that, and that's why the Ukrainians were led into failure, because they were promised things that the West is not able to fulfill. You know, this support for as long as it takes and things like this. This is something that, because at that time, the West still expected a very quick victory over Russia.
Why was that? Sorry, not to cut you off again, but I don't understand this idea because of what Russia was built up to be. Because it seems to me that the West had two paradoxes in the informational space running. And this is the Russophrenia, that is the term that is being coined at the moment. The Schrodinger's Russia is that it is about to take over the world at the same time as it's about to collapse. And there's this paradox of Putin's in Schrodinger's box. And this is always been to me, I think this is fucking ridiculous, is that there's this idea that Russia, from the Western intelligence agencies, that Russia will take over Ukraine in 3 days. But at then the same time, we said that Russia will collapse very quickly and Ukraine will achieve all of its maximalist goals of territory and political aims, say NATO and EU as well. And what I'm asking is, for someone who has worked in that space, how is it these complete readings of intel all opposed to each other?
Yeah, it's a. I mean, you're absolutely right to ask a question, because this is definitely the kind of paradox we have. The thing is that at the very start, in 2021, when you listened all the experts and all that about Russia, they were all saying that Russia was about to crumble, the economy was weak, and the society hated Vladimir Putin, and the whole thing was about to collapse. And even the French Minister of Economy on the 1st of March 2022 said, we will make the whole Russia to collapse through sanctions, because this was this idea that the country was so in an unstable situation that it required very little to make the whole thing collapse like a house of cards. And that was the narrative. And that was also the narrative in order to press Ukraine into a situation where it doesn't negotiate. Remember, I said before, the whole operation, the military operation, started on the 24th of February. The 25th, that means 1 day later, Zelensky asked the Swiss foreign minister to have a peace conference. I mean, 1 day later, because Zelensky probably had the feeling that the whole thing was not going in favor of Ukraine. And that's why he tried to have a negotiation from the very beginning. And in order to prevent that, the West developed this narrative that Russia was very close to collapse and they had no ammunition, the military was weak, and in order to support that narrative, you had all this picture, especially from the Donbass region. Again, we are back to this Donbass armies that were less well trained than the Russian ones, and therefore they came very well into the Western narrative to show that the Russians were not up to the mark and things like this. In any case, we developed this narrative. Today, we are exactly in the opposite position somehow. Now we have to convince, especially the West and the Western population, and that's very true in Germany, in France. On the 5th of March, for instance, Emmanuel Macron made a speech to the French people saying that we are on the verge of a war with Russia and war will attack us and things like this. So the problem is that the population in the Western Europe, everybody, including in the military, even if they don't dare to say it openly, but a lot of people I've met in the French intelligence, for instance, they know what the situation is. And they know that the Russians have the upper hand in the conflict, and they know they are winning and all that. But the problem is, in that situation, how do you convince the population to make sacrifice in economic terms and things like this to support Ukraine? So in order to convince the population to do this sacrifice, then you change the narrative and you say, well, Russia is now winning, and is not winning. He's not winning, but he's threatening us.
Yeah, well, it's a great observation, because it's the exact observation myself and my audience have made. Is you had this tactic shift of Russia's going to be defeated if we just give a little bit more to Ukraine. But at the same time, in the same breath, you have the audacity to turn around and go, Russia is militarizing and has the economy that can then have a existential threat to Western NATO. And that's meaning they're going to move through Ukraine, move through Poland, move through all these states to get to France and Germany, these behemoth states sitting there. And what I've said is, either way you're saying that is catastrophic, because if Russia, if you are telling the truth and Russia does have the power to frontally attack Germany and France, then delivering another couple of $1 billion to Ukraine is going to make zero impact at all, because they're going to have to, you're dismissing the resistance that a country like Poland, who is a major military power with historical hate against Russia, so you've got a lot of nationalism to fight and a lot of morale to fight as well.
Yeah.
It's this complete lie that has been fabricated, that Russia has this goal of, taking Paris, and that has been done, as you say, to fabricate this support for a war which people have fatigue to. Now, I understand how propaganda works in this, but I think the problem is too many people are intelligent and who are seeing straight through this, because even if Russia has never said that they have any want to take Munich or Berlin or Paris or wherever. But also, if you asked behind closed doors, if you approached a Russian general and said, "Hey, do you think you've got the military power to do this?" He'd say, "No. We at the end of the day, the amount of resource we would need to do something like this in a modern era and multi-front war, no." So they haven't shown the capability to do it, or the desire, which is the two factors you'd think you'd at least need. But it's been fabricated on this idea of going from Ukraine can win and saying that Germany's has an existential threat to their existence. And I'm saying, well, that is Schrodinger's Putin.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is totally absurd. And the problem is that, again, because the problem is that we're trapped into our narrative, because we declared that Russia was weak at the very beginning of the special military operation. Therefore, our help as support to Ukraine was supposed to be effective, because we could provide this support. And since Russia was defined as weak, that means that the support was not supposed to be in the long run. That was for a very short period of time. And therefore, we could afford to say that we would support Ukraine for as long as it takes, because in fact, as long as we take, we should say as short as it takes, because we didn't expect that to last so long. And what we have seen in the last year, both in the US and in Europe, by the way, is that the capacities, industrial as well as military capacity of the West, are exhausted. I mean, in addition to that, you had the conflict in Palestine with the support provided to Israel and things like this, meaning that the West has reached the limits of the support it can provide to Ukraine, and the limits it has at large, because in fact, would Russia start a war with the West, he could probably win. I mean, again, this is totally hypothetical, because the Russians don't have the capacities to occupy, because it's fine to destroy the armies, but then you have to occupy the territory, and I'm not sure the Russian forces are designed for this, in fact. But that's. But in any case, we have weakened our own military apparatuses in the West, and the thing is that was simply because we were so convinced of the lies we have said that we provided this help to Ukraine without noticing that, in fact, we were just running into a dead end with that. And now we are approaching the dead end. The problem is that today you have a different forces that are at play. And that's the reason why I wrote this book on covert wars in Ukraine, because we talk very much about Europe, United States, Russia, and of course, the armored forces of Ukraine. But now what we have to take into account is the population of Ukraine. And that's probably what is at stake for the Russians, because what we see now in Ukraine is that you have, I mean, when I'm not talking about the Russian occupied part, but the Kievan part of Ukraine, where you have more and more people disagreeing with the government. You have a lot of people disagreeing with the Westerners. And I just remind you, just a couple of days ago, as you had this issue with the anti-corruption bureau, the NABU and the SAPO and so on. But interesting to see that Yulia Tymoshenko, who was considered as a certain time for a possible replacement for Zelensky, by the way, but Yulia Tymoshenko made an address to the Ukrainian parliament saying now we should get rid of all these institutions that are driven by the West. And we should get to start to be decolonized by the West. So you see that now you have some kind of you have individuals in Ukraine that understand that the West has led them on the wrong way. And probably now they should work on some kind of more independence and more sovereignty as regard their own security policy and the defense policy and the defense posture toward Russia. I'm not saying that Yulia Tymoshenko is pro-Russian. I'm not saying that. She's definitely not. But they understand that now they are facing two alternatives: fighting for the eternity somehow, or getting absorbed or destroyed or completely disbanded by the war with Russia.
And this is something that I've spoken out on length, is the anti-West rhetoric that is developing more and more inside of Ukraine, because it's gone from this idea of there's historical hate against the Russians, and of course reinforced by the war that Russia has launched into Ukraine, the offensive ability moving in. But then there's this idea too of like this abandonment as well. And as anyone would know, it is, you feel more deeply about someone who you considered being your ally or your friend than going against you, abandoning you, and making false promises to you, than someone who you just don't like. And I'm not then saying, and what I've said is, this doesn't mean that you'll have Ukraine and Russia singing Kumbaya around the campfire. But what can develop straight way further is the Ukrainian population has been told, not to, absolutely clear as day, the sacrifice that you are making, the sacrifice you are sending your brothers and your sons and your friends into, whilst the sacrifice you make at home, you are doing this because we are with you for however long, whatever it takes, to be part of NATO, to be part of the EU, to regain your territorial integrity. And what I've said is, obviously, all of that is not going to take place without an existential threat to the state. It would just would not exist in this attritional style of war. And what then can develop is this deep anti-Western rhetoric that I'm already seeing come in. And this is exactly the byproduct of attritional war. The goal of attritional war is not victory, it is to have your enemy lose. And that attrition, the goal of attrition is to rot your adversary systems through pressure. And it's military pressure, it's diplomatic pressure, it's political pressure. And that what we have seen, and I think we've seen this a lot in the past couple of months, is rot within the institutions. We've seen rot within NATO and SABU. We've seen rot within Ukraine, Zelensky's administration. We've seen rot within, then now today, the military, there's military commanders questioning Zelensky's authority with open letters today going. And I've said, this is all byproducts you'd expect to see. And this can be very dangerous down the line of, yeah, well, they fought us, but you abandoned us. How does that actually then become? And this role of propaganda, as Mr. Tetragami Ue, who I think is one of the best analysts in this war on X and Telegram, that he says the role of propaganda is always a double-edged sword, that there's a role of propaganda for good, but you will pay the piper, that eventually it's going to come back on you. And if we have this propaganda campaign of you're going to retrieve 91 borders, you're going to be, the next capital city of Europe and NATO and the EU, and everyone's coming home and all of this, and Russia would never be a threat to you again. And then that doesn't end, even if it ends in a pretty reasonable way. That idea of being abandoned, being lied to, what does that breed in already what we have seen of extreme nationalist elements that can operate there and reinforce those ideas as well?
Well, I completely agree with you. And the fact that the Western propaganda focused on Russia and forgot about, if we have to remember also that at the very beginning of the special military operation, and even before, in fact, the Western propaganda focused on this idea that the whole Ukrainian population was behind Zelensky. And it's interesting that most of this propaganda was based, of course, on those nationalist elements, well, strongly nationalist. I never used the word Nazi for them, as some do, because these nationalist elements who are strongly anti-Russian, and which during Second World War for a while were supported by the Germans, and even helped the Germans in some instances. They also fought the Germans. That's something which is not only very well understood in the West, that these Ukrainians during World War II used the opportunity of having the Third Reich to recognize some kind of independence of the Ukrainian, and their first independence, in fact, comes from the recognition from the Nazi, and the Nazi liberated Kharkov in 1943. That's why the division Das Reich, and with the famous emblem, this Volksangel, has become the emblem of the Azov Brigade, with a slight modification, because the division Das Reich liberated Kharkov from the Soviets. And therefore, you still have this relationship. But if we look carefully at history, we also notice that at some point, the Ukrainian nationalists, exactly the same that praised the help of the Germans, also fought against the Germans. And so because ultimately these Ukrainian nationalists try to fight for their own independence. And once they discovered that the Germans were not, let's say, promoting Ukrainian independence, but another kind of occupation, they started to fight the German. So this is why we should keep the word nationalist and ultra-nationalist probably, but I don't use the word Nazi because I explained. Now, at the beginning of the conflict, we also based all our judgment that Ukraine was united against the Russians. But it was based on this nationalist movement. And today, you have the same nationalists who understand that now they are facing this, another kind of adversary, if you want. This, exactly what you said, this allies, or these allies who become your own enemy, because at the end of the day, they are misusing you for their purposes. And that's why, if you look at demonstrations, for instance, of those ultranationalists, especially in the western part of Ukraine, you see demonstration, and I've seen myself some of them in Kiev when I was there. You see the European flag, I mean, the flag of the European Union with a red cross on it, because they don't want the European Union. They see that it's also something that is against their own interest. So this is this evolution, because we focused on Russia, we focused on the fact that Ukraine was united. We forgot the fact that, as in any country, the Ukrainian population is diverse, that you have people who are more extreme and other less. And I also have shown in my book on covert war, that the covert wars in Ukraine, that the willingness to defend Ukraine with arms, not just to have a passive defense, but let's say active defense, the willingness to defend by taking arms. And you had two polls made in Ukraine in 2021, and in just in February or January 2022, right before the military intervention, the Russian intervention. And this poll, made by the Kiev Institute for the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, in those polls, you could see that, in fact, the Ukrainian population was not really ready to take arms against the Russians. And that was before the war. And of course, you had difference. I mean, the east of the country, they were definitely not ready to fight the Russians, because they are also ethnic Russian. But if you look also in the western part of Ukraine, although obviously the number of people who are ready to resist militarily with arms against the Russians is higher than in the east, but nevertheless, it was not a significant part of the population who was ready to fight against the Russians. And today, we see that these differences are coming to the surface, and people are questioning the need, or not the need, it's not a question of need, but the relevance of continuing the war with the Russians, because they observe that people die, first of all. And I think also the Kiev Institute of Sociology made a survey that was in 2023. And you had one person out of 6, I think, who knew someone who died in the war. 1 out of 6 knew someone who had died. So that means that a lot of people, and that was in 2023. Today, the situation must be certainly more severe, meaning that the population understand the sacrifice they are paying. And they understand that probably Zelensky was not on the right path with this war. And probably it should be an alternative way to that. And probably this alternative way must somehow accept ceding territory and some concessions at large to Russia. So, and this sentiment is growing.
Absolutely.
And that is something that the Western propaganda doesn't want to address, because it would show that Zelensky is no longer legitimate, and Technically, we can, of course, question his legitimacy because the end of his mandate and all that. But I don't want to enter that because it's a legal issue, and there are probably pros and cons about this. But the legitimacy in terms of how close Zelensky is of the expectation of the population. That's what, in fact, defines the legitimacy. That how the population can identify itself with Zelensky objectives and his way of leading the country, and this legitimacy is obviously fading away.
And I've been saying, when we see on the 15th of August, when this becomes the Trump and Putin meeting, that what a lot of people in the pro-Ukrainian space are saying is, no matter what Zelensky does, the Ukrainians will continue fighting. And I've said there may be some groups that continue, okay, maybe. But what I've said is, if Trump offers the Ukrainian people en masse, who obviously are hiding from mobilization, who aren't recruiting and looking for ways to get out, if Trump offers Zelensky a way out of the war, the way to stop killing, and Zelensky rejects it from the backing of Merz and Macron and Callas and von der Leyen and whoever, I think we could see unrest in the state, because I think there'd be a lot of people are going, hang on, I've lost so many to this war. There would be zero Ukrainians who would not know someone who has been killed in the war. I know approximately maybe 30 people who have been killed overall, both Westerners, both like Westerners I served with and Ukrainians, civilians and militarymen. No one knows someone who hasn't been killed. And if there's an olive branch extended from the US going, this is what we could end right now. Yeah. Yes, a lot of people are going to be unhappy and feel it's unfair. But if that is then rejected, and what is the other alternative to this is a gamble for years more of war and a trajectory of the war which is deteriorating very quickly. And I always say, I call it the theory of bankruptcy, that attritional war is very slow at once, and then it drops off a cliff like going bankrupt. You don't lose your house and your wife and your kids at a linear rate. It's nothing, and then you're out in your ass. That we could see unrest against Zelensky, that, hey, it was offered, this could have ended. We were happy. Some of us were unhappy to give up areas, but we saw that as being the price of to stop the killing, and that this war is growing existential to Ukrainians, more so to the territorial integrity of Ukraine's 91 international border.
Yes, no, I completely agree. I mean, the thing is that, for instance, I mean, if you look at what's happening on the ground, and that's a reason why I wrote this book on the covert wars in Ukraine, is that you have obviously, I'm talking now of the Ukrainian territory. I mean, Ukrainian under the authority of Kiev. You have obviously Russian resistance movement that have emerged and who are rather active, especially when it comes to intelligence providing, I mean, humans to the Russians. But what I have discovered is that you also have Ukrainian resistance movement developing in Ukraine.
Yes.
And those Ukrainian movement who have nothing to do with Russian ethnic Russians, I mean, they're obviously Ukrainian movement, they cooperate with those Russian or ethnic Russian movements in Ukraine, and they share information, they share intelligence, and they provide intelligence. I mean, because these Ukrainian movements, they have probably no direct relations to the Russian intelligence. I mean, you have individuals from the GRU that are deployed in Ukraine to collect information and to organize intelligence networks there. And Probably, again, I don't know all the details, but apparently those Ukrainian resistance movement do not have direct relation to Russian intelligence, but they use Russian resistance movement to inform Russian intelligence networks. And and a lot of attacks that occur recently, you have seen these attacks against the recruitment centers, for instance. The information comes from the Ukrainians. You see, it's not the Russians who decide just for the sake of their own fantasy to strike a recruitment center. This was a request from a Ukrainian resistance movement to the Russians to strike the recruitment center. And after the Russians struck with the missile or so, with drones, I don't remember exactly, this recruitment center, the Ukrainian resistance thanked the Russians. So we see that when we talk about the resistance against Kiev, is not simply just demonstrations about Nabu, Sapo, and things like this. It's not just that. It's not just a political opposition in that sense. It goes further. There are people who think that the current government is not legitimate. And of course, this forced recruitment policy that the Ukrainian government was in fact forced to use because they don't have anybody to put on the front line, so they have to force the recruitment. But this policy has been, in fact, the trigger for most resistance movement you have now, and it's a symbol of the illegitimacy of the power in Kiev, and that's one of the points where the Ukrainian population is that focus, in fact, the opposition. In fact, that's the focal point of the opposition is this recruitment policy, and around this, you have a lot of other aspects, of course, because related to the forced recruitment, you have the corruption. And we had this example of this recruitment officer that, in fact, has now left Ukraine and is living in Cyprus in a big villa of, I don't know, a 4 million euro villa and things like this in Cyprus, because with all the bribes he collected, like this. So the whole thing, and of course this. I mean, it is so when you have a country in conflict, there is a point where you will have corruption. You had this in all the conflicts before, in Second World War, in all wars. The conflict somehow promotes the development of corruption. And Ukraine was already one of the most corrupt countries, I mean, the most corrupt country in Europe, in fact, based on what Transparency International used to say at the time. I'm talking about 2020, 2021. Any case, it has always been a corrupt government, and myself being in NATO, I've been very briefly involved in a project, in fact, led by NATO, a so-called integrity initiative led by NATO, funded by Norway, and in order to fight corruption. And that was in 2015 or something like that. So, I mean, corruption is endemic there. But the current situation, where obviously you have forced recruitment and all that, in fact, just promotes further corruption. And that's where we are. And the more corruption you have, the less legitimate become the government, the authorities, the institutions, and all that. And in fact, as you rightly said, depending on what the outcome of these discussions or this round of negotiation comes, we may well have here some let's say, rationale for some individuals in Ukraine to start more, let's say, unrest and more open resistance against the government. Let's put it that way.
And
We
that is
have
definitely something.
in that context, we also have to be also careful, because the security service, the SBU, which is the domestic security service, is extremely powerful in Ukraine, extremely powerful, and is everywhere. It's as the KGB was during the Cold War in Soviet Union. Is everywhere, the SBU, and you have daily reports that SBU attacks individuals who are suspected to be part of the resistance and things like that. You have daily this kind of reports. So yes, we can expect some resistance and open resistance to emerge, but at the same time, we have to be very careful, because at the same time, the security apparatus is so oversized in Ukraine that we may not see that up to the point when the resistance, I mean, the sacrifice by the population becomes unacceptable. And we may have a situation where we don't have demonstrations and things like that, but very quickly we jump into a full-fledged type of revolution, if you want, because everything that stays in the middle has been tampered by the SBU and things like this. People were arrested and all that, but there will be a point where all that becomes unacceptable, unbearable, and that might be a possible not outcome, but a possible evolution of the situation. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but that might well be that. Yes.
Jacques, is there anything in this conversation of the last 2.25 hours, is there anything that you believe that we have missed that is important? I know you and I could speak about this for hours and hours, but is there anything really important that you think is misunderstood, that we haven't covered, that my audience should be aware of?
Well, I think we have addressed the essential. There are obviously a lot of issues we could talk about, but I think we have addressed the essential, because at the end of the day, this conflict is extremely simple. As I said, there is a lot of complexities inside, obviously, but it's simple in the sense that we have, I think, very well outlined the perverse role of the West in driving Ukraine towards war and preventing every rational move from the Ukrainians themselves to stop the conflict. And I think that's the essence, because that's probably what we will see at play in the coming days and weeks, depending on the result of the negotiation in Alaska. But I think we have addressed that. Of course, we could discuss a lot of issues more. I mean, you're a military or former military, myself also. We could have discussed a lot of issues more related to the operational art and things like this. There are a lot of issues we could address as well. Again, that's something we may discuss another time, and I will have to go, by the way. So this is probably not. We will not start a new discussion on all that. But there is a lot of substance here to discuss. I think we have talked about the essential. I mean, if people understand what we have discussed here, they will understand what is at stake in Alaska and what is at stake for the future of Ukraine. And in fact, we have mentioned the Trump-Putin meeting, the upcoming Trump-Putin meetings many times, meaning that despite the fact that we came back to history to explain all that, we have addressed this all these aspects in the light of what will happen in the coming days. So I think we have here addressed the essential. But again, I'm ready to talk about so many issues that we could discuss in the details. That may come to the surface again. I see that the Europeans come again with the Budapest Memorandum and all that. All these aspects could be discussed because they are fascinating, because all of them reflect also the misinformation that that governs the polity in the West. So all these aspects could be discussed as well. But I think we have addressed the most interesting aspects. I mean, not the most interesting, it's not true. Let's say the most fundamental, probably the most fundamental. And I think you rightly started this conversation by discussing the perception of war of the Russians. And I think that's the essence. If we understand the way the Russians understand the relation between politics, war, and hence peace, then we have understood the whole mechanics that drive the Russian thinking. And if we understand that, that could help to find solutions, let's say, or to understand possible solutions. So I think that would be my conclusion, if based on your question. And again, there are multiple aspects that we can probably discuss more specifically. I know you're very much interested in the military dimension of the conflict, and there are also a lot of aspects we can discuss. Tactical, technical, the relation between tactical, technical, operational, and strategic. There are also a lot of issues we can discuss there, which could be, I mean, fascinating, and that are fascinating, and happy to discuss that at a later stage. But so far, I think we have addressed the most pressing issues as regards the upcoming events of geopolitical events.
Yes, and I look incredibly forward to discussing more of these events as, of course, they unfold and evolve, and on highly specific items too. But I think what your book captures very well is this holistic nature of war. And if you read your book, and then I say people go and read, if you're so well inclined to read On War from Karl von Clausewitz, that war isn't just a series of photographs and individual events that take place. It is a film, it's a video, and there is this holistic view, and a view that in which the West, we have forgotten of why war exists as a tool, and that we are told, whether it's from the very upper echelon of command, that the reason for war, not just this war, but the reason for war is for bloodthirsty, dictator, crazy individuals, and war may be carried out by some, but that's not the reason for war. That war is a tool of when diplomacy has failed, and it's an expensive tool, it's a catastrophic tool, it's a blunt force instrument, but there's a reason for war, and there's always a reason why we end up back at war as human beings, and we don't understand that very fundamental, and to take the battlefield will be reciprocated within diplomacy as much as people would like to ignore it. People like to ignore it because Ukraine is losing on the battlefield. I guarantee if Ukraine was winning on the battlefield, people would understand this translation between war, peace as a constant moving flux, as well as the way that then can influence negotiations. And Mr. Jacques Baud, I know you're a busy man. Of course, with a new book out only in the past month, I believe it came out in June, of covert wars in Ukraine. I haven't had the pleasure yet of reading it, but you can pick up all of your work across. If people Google your name, they'll find it. It's everywhere available, depending on your state, of course, but it'll be there. And mate, just thank you very much for spending a couple of hours with myself, and I know my audience will get so much out of this.
That was my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. And greetings to the southern hemisphere.
Well, mate,
That was
look,
my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
thank you very much. Have a nice day. Yeah, bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.